Well, thank you for joining us once again. Welcome to Grace. Good to have you with us today for our study. Now, when we concluded our previous lesson, the fourth bucket of wrath that God promised would fall upon the nation of Israel, remember these buckets of wrath, He promised them that they would fall upon them. There were certain negative things that contained judgment sitting in these buckets to prove to them that they were not living up to that contract they signed on to there at Mount Sinai. They said they could live up to the law for their righteousness. God said, if you do, I'm going to bless you, but if you don't, I'm going to curse you. And He set forth 5 buckets of wrath. Your Bible's laid out, by the way, with the exception of Paul's epistles, according to these 5 buckets of wrath. So as we go through these buckets, we can see where we are in connection with God's program and plan with the nation Israel. Bucket number 4 had fallen in our previous lesson. Now, bucket number 4 called for God to bring a sword upon Israel to avenge the quarrel of His covenant. This is not a rain problem. It's not an enemy coming in, stealing crops and running. It's not about paying tribute in order to eat. This isn't an animal problem here, that wild animals in the land. This is a sword. This fourth, you can see the increase of the seriousness of these buckets as they began to fall. God would bring a sword upon Israel. Let's take a quick look back at Leviticus chapter 26, where this bucket's described in verses 23 through 26, and we'll see what Israel could expect with the pouring out of bucket of wrath number 4. I will bring a sword upon you that shall avenge the quarrel of my covenant. It's almost like they're quarreling over this. We're doing it, you're not doing it. We're doing it, you're not doing it. Pardon me. And when you are gathered together within your cities, not because of wild animals, but because of the sword, I will send the pestilence among you, and ye shall be delivered into the hands of the enemy. And when I have broken the staff of your bread, here's famine. 10 women shall bake your bread in one oven. That's how little bread there would be to go around. They shall deliver you your bread again by weight, and ye shall eat and not be satisfied. So 2 issues here, a sword and famine. The fourth bucket of wrath would result in enemy invasion and severe famine coming upon the nation. The marker showing us the timing of the fall of bucket number 4, as I'm sure you'll recall, was 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 32. If we back up a verse to verse 31, we find why Israel was meriting, why they were actually calling for this fourth bucket to fall. Keep in mind that God was dealing with the nation at that time through her kings. So God was working with the kings, and as went the way of the kings, that was the way the nation would go. Verse 31, chapter 10, says this about a king named King Jehu, the king over the northern kingdom. 2 Kings 10:31, but Jehu, as some people pronounce it, Jehu, took no heed to walk in the law of the Lord God of Israel with all his heart, for he departed not from the sins of Jeroboam, which made Israel to sin. The next 2 verses, verses 32 and 33, mark the falling of bucket of wrath number 4 in response to King Jehu's defiance of both the law contract and the Most High God. Here it is, 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 32. In those days the Lord began to cut Israel short, and Hazael smote them in the coasts of Israel. Now the enemies come in. You can see the sword that God was bringing, and you know you're in that fourth bucket of wrath in Leviticus. From Jordan eastward, all the land of Gilead, the Gadites, the Reubenites, the Manassites, from Aroer, which is by the river Arnon, even Gilead and Bashan. So Hazael, king of Syria, was the king wielding the sword that God described to Israel in bucket number 4, described in Leviticus chapter 26, the portion we just read. As you can see on our illustration entitled Israel Cut Short, Hazael smote God's nation in the coasts of Israel. Whereas the people of Israel had initially settled on both sides of the Jordan River, they were now confined to the west side of the Jordan River as Hazael began to eat up their territory, encroaching on what belonged to Israel. Bucket of wrath number 4 called for invasion of the land, and this is precisely what was taking place as Hazael was carrying that sword, and Israel was reaping what they had sown by not making their confession that they'd failed the contract. By invading the land, King Hazael was performing a geographical cutting of Israel. That's what this cutting them short is all about. Now, as we look back at our illustration entitled The 5 Buckets of Wrath, and your Bible again laid out according to these 5 buckets, where Israel's program is concerned, we can see that 4 buckets had already fallen upon the nation. There was a single bucket remaining, only 1 bucket left to fall, bucket number 5, and that bucket number 5 had yet to fall upon Israel. This final bucket would complete Israel's education in their need to have the Most High God exercise His name on their behalf and to do so graciously. So this final bucket of wrath was designed to bring them to their knees and bring them to that point where they realized that they had no capacity in themselves to become that peculiar treasure unto God. No ability to become that nation above all nations, that holy nation, that kingdom of priests, through any work in any manner of the flesh. When this final bucket is empty, as we said, Israel will have learned the lesson of who they are not, who God is, and therefore the absolute necessity of casting themselves upon His name and relying solely upon Him to become for them what they could never be able to become for themselves or for Him, because there would be no capacity in the flesh to do that. Now, as we think back to our previous session, when bucket of wrath number 4 fell, King Jehu was on the throne of the northern kingdom. And I'm giving you some northern, southern kingdom kings here because this is what the book of 2 Kings is all about. The kingdom was divided, we know that, earlier on, bucket of wrath number 2. The kingdom was divided into a 2-realm situation. And so now we have the king of the northern kingdom. The king prior to King Jehu was King Jeroboam, as you can see. And King Jeroboam had allied with King Ahaziah of the southern kingdom. They were going to team up and work together to fight against the Syrians. They were always battling Syria. But because of the behavior of both of those kings, God told Elisha, his prophet, for the second and third bucket of wrath, to send a prophet to anoint Jehu to replace Jehoram as Israel's king. After which Jehu was directed to totally destroy the entire house of Ahab, which would include both Jehoram and Ahaziah, because those two came from the house of Ahab. Now Jehu, as you recall, did precisely as he had been instructed to do. He even killed King Ahab's wife, Jezebel. Anybody remember Jezebel? He killed Jezebel. He tossed her, had her tossed out the window, and he trampled her down with the horses of his chariot. So we discussed that last week. The sad thing was that even though Jehu followed God's instructions and destroyed the worshipers of Baal from the land, as we read, he took no heed. Chapter 10, verses 31 and 30, verse 31 just told us, he took no heed to walk in the law of the God of Israel with all his heart. Thus, the falling of the nation's 4th bucket of wrath. Chapter 10 of 2 Kings ends with verses 35, so let's go there very quickly. And Jehu slept with his fathers, and they buried him in Samaria. That was the capital city of the northern kingdom. And Jehoahaz, his son, reigned in his stead. And the time that Jehu reigned over Israel and Samaria was 28 years. So you have a king for 28 years over the northern kingdom. This brings us to 2 Kings chapter 11, and where the story continues with King Ahaziah's mother. You can see him on the right-hand side, or see her on the right-hand side there, Queen Athaliah. She's reigning up on the throne of the southern kingdom in the absence of her son. Now, we're not going to follow the complete story of the remainder of the kings, but we will hit a few highlights, and we'll give you the summary statement given to us in the Bible as we continue forward in our study of Israel's kings. The first highlight I want you to notice is how Satan, busy behind the scenes, we might say, went to work through Queen Athaliah. Do you recall how Satan had been told that the seed of the woman would actually crush his head? So he knew that there would be a seed line from this woman that would crush his head. What Satan had wanted all along was to eliminate the seed line from which that promised seed would come. And there was no question in that day as to who was the royal seed, and Satan knew that. The first battle strategy that Satan employed was the battle strategy or battle plan that I called Operation Deception Alienation. That took place where? That took place in the garden. The serpent deceived Eve. That was the deception. Then even though Adam had not been deceived, both he and Eve disobeyed God's clear instruction to not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Alienation was the result. It was deception, alienation. Of course, God countered that plot of Satan by supplying a sacrifice for his human creatures. And he then clothed that human creation with the skins of their sacrifice. Thus, Satan was thwarted in his initial operation. Then came Operation Agitation, Assassination. Satan instigated jealousy in the mind of Cain, after which Cain did what? He slew Abel. Of course, God's plan to bring the conquering seed through the line of Eve wouldn't be thwarted through Cain's agitation or Abel's assassination. Adam and Eve would have additional children, and the seed line would now pass through Seth. So Satan had been thwarted once again in his plan to eliminate the seed. Satanic operation number 3 was what I've called Operation Infiltration Degradation. Why not degrade the seed line by way of infiltrating that seed line through the use of some of the rebellious angelic creation? This satanic intervention resulted in the giants that were in the land in that day. As we discovered in our earlier studies, God fought on Israel's behalf, and Israel would eventually defeat those giants who had been in the land that was promised to Israel. I've called Satan's 4th major battle strategy Operation Extermination Annihilation. The idea with this operation would be to exterminate the entire seed line and exterminate that seed line altogether. Just get rid of it. How could a promised seed conqueror come through a non-existent royal seed line? The plan was simple: wholesale genocide that would come through not one but several attempts, as we're going to see through the Bible. I'm sure some of you recall the attempt that came through Pharaoh in the days of Moses. Do you recall that? And how Moses had to be hid in the bulrushes there. We see the second attempt in connection with Operation Extermination Annihilation with King Jehoram, who was slain by King Jehu. Let's go back to our illustration entitled "The Kings of First Kings" to gain a more clear picture of extermination attempt number 2, because here's where it sits. Now, don't get confused. Some people do when you see some of the same names appearing on both the southern and northern kingdom listing here. While some of the names are the same, because those names, people just kept the same names, the individuals were not the same individuals. For instance, there was a King Ahaziah over the northern kingdom and a different King Ahaziah who ruled over the southern kingdom, as you might see on your list. So don't think it's the same king just switching back and forth the area of his rulership. Likewise, there was a King Jehoram in connection with the northern kingdom. We talked about him earlier on. That Jehoram was slain by Jehu, as we noted in our previous lesson. It is the southern kingdom Jehoram, the 5th king over the southern kingdom, that we want to look at now. Jehoram's father, Jehoshaphat, was king before Jehoram. Jehoshaphat had 7 sons, according to the account in 2 Chronicles. And remember, the Chronicles are stories highlighted and enhanced a little bit, in some cases, of the stories in 2 Kings. So we needn't go through all of 1 and 2 Chronicles. Jehoshaphat evidently loved all of his 7 sons. But Jehoram was the favored son when it came to his father's selection to be Judah, the southern kingdom's next king. Why so? Well, he was the firstborn. But notice what Jehoshaphat did just before he died, as recorded in 2 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 3. And their father gave them, those 7 sons, great gifts of silver and of gold and of precious things, with fenced cities in Judah. Can you imagine getting a gift and it being a city? But the kingdom gave he to Jehoram. Why? Because Jehoram was the firstborn. Now, most likely, in fear of the possibility of a coup by one of his brothers, this is how closely these guys were, King Jehoram went to extreme measures. The extreme measure we see in verse 4. Now, when Jehoram was risen up to the kingdom of his father, Jehoshaphat, he strengthened himself and slew all his brethren with the sword. Can you imagine that? And many others also of the princes or of the royalty of Israel. Jehoram was 32 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. So now we've got a king over the southern kingdom. He's eliminating anyone who might come up and replace him. He doesn't have to worry about that now. This King Jehoram wasn't taking any chances, was he? Let's get rid of him. To secure his position as king over the southern kingdom, he killed his 6 brothers, along with the elimination of many of that royal line, they're the princes of Israel. To his way of thinking, there would be no royal seed remaining to commit a coup. So do you see why I called the second attempt by Satan to exterminate the seed line Operation Extermination Annihilation? Let's just get rid of the seed line. But Satan didn't stop there. He had a few more attempts up his sleeve when it came to exterminating the line of the royal seed. His third attempt took place in the 11th chapter of the book of 2 Kings, where we are right now, as Queen Athaliah took the throne over the southern kingdom after the death of her son Ahaziah, the king killed by Jehu's men when Jehu pulled the bow back and let the sword fly, or the arrow fly. I think you'll spot this immediately, this extermination attempt, as we look at the opening verse. What was the first project that Queen Athaliah undertook as she became the ruler over the southern kingdom? Well, here it is in chapter 11 rather, verse 1 of 2 Kings. And when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the seed royal. Now, she's going to be the only one. These people were vicious, were they not? How would you like a mother or some brothers of this sort? How did God thwart Satan's third attempt to exterminate the seed line? The answer is sitting in verse 2. Because she destroyed all the seed royal with an exception. Look at verse 2 in chapter 11. But Jehosheba, the daughter of King Jehoram, sister of Ahaziah, took Joash the son of Ahaziah and stole him from among the king's sons, which were slain, and they hid him, much like Moses, even him and his nurse, but not in the bulrushes, in the bedchamber from Athaliah, so he was not slain. So they've hidden one away. They've hidden an infant away. Now, I place Satan's Operation Extermination Annihilation prior to his subversive plan called Operation Corruption Religion. You think Satan would like religion? Oh, he'd love it. He'd love any attempt that man could make to try to earn his righteousness through his performance. So, yes, Operation Corruption Religion was something that Satan was very much interested in. And it began, really, back in the days of Moses, when he was an infant, before the giving of the law, was that extermination annihilation attempt. Of course, with the giving of the law, Operation Corruption Religion came into full swing. But the nation Israel was corrupted by the nations around them, as we've seen on and on here, as God's people began serving the gods, little g, of the nations around them. Precisely what God had warned them against. The religion side of the operation came through the pride nature resident in the people of Israel. The pride nature resident in all mankind that we inherited from Grandpappy Adam, as we've said many times. The people of Israel assumed themselves to be capable of obeying the law of Moses in order to gain acceptance with God by way of their performance. They thought they could do it. God proved them to be wrong. Israel's buckets of wrath were sitting there, and then it began tipping on Israel to prove to them, you're not doing it, you're not doing it. You think you're doing it, you're not doing it. How could God thwart Satan's plan called Operation Corruption Religion? The answer is righteousness before God would come by way of belief, not by way of behavior. So that plan was thwarted. We'll see some future attempts in connection with Operation Extermination Annihilation in our studies ahead. But for now, let's get back to the book of 2 Kings and continue our look at the rulers of both kingdoms, northern and southern. Jehoiada was the high priest during the days of Queen Athaliah of the southern realm, the southern kingdom. It was Jehoiada, the high priest, and Jehosheba, King Athaliah's sister, or Queen Athaliah's sister, actually King Ahaziah's sister, who had stolen the infant Joash away so that Queen Athaliah could not have her nephew slain. When Joash, sometimes called Jehoash, they interchanged the way it's written here, when he was 7 years old, remember he was hidden away, and when he was 7 years old, high priest Jehoiada, who had taken part in that kidnapping, so to speak, to save his life, that high priest anointed Joash to be king over the southern realm, Judah. Of course, when Athaliah heard the people crying, God save the king, God save the king, she did a bit of crying herself. She didn't like that a bit. She cried, treason, treason. But it was to no avail. Her 7-year-old nephew was now king over the southern kingdom, and Queen Athaliah would soon be slain. Joash, as I said, also called Jehoash, would go on to reign over the southern kingdom for 40 years. He would become known as one of the southern kingdom's better kings. There was what might be called a short revival under this king, Joash. As long as priest Jehoiada was alive to guide this king, things were looking good. It appears as things might turn around for the southern kingdom. But notice what we find as we come to 2 Kings chapter 11, verse 17. And Jehoiada made a covenant between the Lord and the king and the people, that they should be the Lord's people, between the king also and the people. Looks like revival's breaking out in the southern realm. So far, so good. Maybe they'll make their national confession, and bucket number 5 can be avoided altogether. From what we've just seen of the nation, we know that that's probably not likely going to happen. But things did look good for a while in the southern realm. Look at verse 18 and the direction that the people were taking during the time of high priest Jehoiada. And all the people of the land went into the house of Baal. This isn't Samaria in this case. This is Jerusalem, capital city of the southern realm, where the people from the surrounding areas in Judah had gone to help Jehoiada eliminate worship to Baal and break it down. His altars, his images, break they in pieces thoroughly, and slew Matan, the priest of Baal, before the altars. And the priest, Jehoiada, appointed officers over the house of the Lord. So it's looking good, isn't it? They're getting Baal, getting rid of this false god Baal. The people of the southern kingdom were doing what the people of the northern kingdom had done earlier. Baal worship was being removed from the land. But as we move forward into chapter 12, it looks like there's reason for high hopes. Notice verse 2 of chapter 12. And Jehoash, that king, did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, and all his days wherein Jehoiada the priest instructed him. So as long as he had that Jehoiada priest sitting there guiding him, twisting his head this way and that, telling him which way to go, Jehoash did a pretty good job. Now notice how quickly high hopes can be dashed as we come to the very next verse, verse 3 in chapter 12. But the high places where that idol worship took place were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and burnt incense in the high places. The bottom line, according to verse 3, was that the people were continuing to worship false gods, the gods of the people around them. They may not have been worshiping Baal any longer in Jerusalem, but Baal hadn't been the only false god in the southern kingdom. False gods were still being worshipped in the high places. It seems as though Jehoash had only been concerned about the capital city, Jerusalem. But what about the outlying areas of that southern kingdom of Judah? There was certainly more to Judah than Jerusalem. Think about the seriousness of what was taking place in the southern kingdom during that point in history. God's plan to repossess the earthly realm and to make his name great in all the earth includes his use of the nation that he promised to make of Abram. When God's plan comes to fulfillment, the Most High God will be preeminent in the minds of the people of his nation. They will be that peculiar treasure unto him above all people on the earth, that royal priesthood, that holy nation, and they will bear the responsibility of making God's name great in the earth. Israel was doing the precise opposite under these kings. False gods held the preeminent place in the minds of the majority of the population of God's nation during this time. The high places were not taken down, as we've just read, and the people were still sacrificing and burning incense in the places of these false gods. We'll look at this a little later on. Listen, if Satan usurped God's headship on planet Earth, and in God's headship in his headship usurpation plan, Satan made it necessary. When we think back, Satan made it necessary in the first place for God to have a plan to use Israel to make his name great in the earth. How angry now do you suppose God, the Most High God, is going to become when the very people his plan calls for him to use in connection with repossessing the earthly realm were in essence worshiping Satan? Can you see why idolatry is the height of human wickedness as we see it in the Bible? As we read on down through the text, we find that it was not only about the people of the southern kingdom practicing wickedness. The priesthood of the southern kingdom had become faithless as well by this point in time. King Jehoash had given clear instruction to the priests. He told them what he wanted done. Let's take a quicker look a quick look at those instructions in verses 4 and 5 of chapter 12. Because Jehoash, he had Baal removed. People were still sacrificing to idols. Now he's going to address the priesthood as God's going to give us a glance of how faithful were the priesthood in that day. 2 Kings chapter 12, verse 4. And Jehoash said to the priests, all the money of the dedicated things that is brought into the house of the Lord, even the money of every one that passeth the account, the money that every man is set at, and all the money that cometh into any man's heart to bring into the house of the Lord. Free will offerings here. Jehoash was saying, you priests of God are to do something with this money that people are going to bring to you. What was it? Verse 5. Let the priests take it to them. Every man of his acquaintance, the ones that come in and meet you and bring you the money, let them, the priests, repair the breaches, meaning fix those gaps, fix those torn places of the house, the temple. Wheresoever any breach shall be found, we want you to repair the temple. In other words, the temple was to be put back in tip-top condition, and the priesthood were there to stand in line, and as the people came with their contributions, the priest would take it, and they'd repair the temple. That was Joash's instructions. But notice verse 6. But it was so that in the 23rd year of King Jehoash, the priest had not repaired the breaches of the house. 23 years into the reign of Jehoash, and nothing at all had been done when it came to the repair of the temple? What was happening to the money? Someone might ask. Well, it appears that the hearts of the priests were no different from the hearts of the people, does it not? The priests were collecting the money all right, and they were keeping it, but they were not doing with that money what King Jehoash had requested they do with it. Fix the temple. So they had to be called on the carpet. And that's precisely what King Jehoash did. Notice verse 7 as it carries the story forward here. Then King Jehoash called for Jehoiada the priest and the other priests, and said unto them, why repair ye not the breaches of the house? Now therefore receive no more money of your acquaintance, but deliver it for the breaches of the house. In other words, don't collect it for any other reason. What's going on with the money here? I told you it was for repairing the house. Don't collect it for any other reason. If you take it, use it for the purpose for which it was supposedly collected. That's what he's saying. The faithlessness of the priesthood was about to become apparent. Look at the priest's response. All that is with exception of the high priest, Jehoiada, in verse 8. And the priest consented to receive no more money of the people, neither to repair the breaches of the house. They weren't complying at all. They were non-compliant. At the very least, it could be said that they hadn't committed to take a collection and then hadn't taken it. They never committed to take a collection in the first place. They didn't want to be any part of it. So high priest Jehoiada had to force the issue. He had to, in a very real sense, take matters into his own hands, which he did. And he promptly did that. Verse 9 reveals it. But Jehoiada the priest took a chest and bored a hole in the lid of it and set it beside the altar on the right side as one cometh into the house of the Lord. And the priest that kept the door put therein all the money that was brought into the house of the Lord. He took a chest and he bored a hole in the top of the chest. Now think about this. This was not about sin offerings and sacrifices here. This was about contributions given to restore the temple. The high priest, in essence, were to take, not the high priest, the priests were to take everything brought to them. But what were they doing with it? They were keeping it. And so here the high priest has to bore a hole in a chest. That was his plan. They're taking the money, I got away. I won't let that money be in their eye shot. They won't see it. He took a chest, he bored a hole in the lid of it. Evidently, had the money hit the hands of the priests, the collection Jehoash had called for would have been a lost cause. And Jehoiada, he knew that. He wouldn't even let them keep looking at what was compounding in the chest. Put it in the hole, in the box, guys. We'll take care of it. We'll build the temple. So the priests, they had to be left out of the collection equation, so to speak. They couldn't see what was being offered. Jehoash had devised a way to keep the money out of the view of those who just may have kept it because they'd been keeping it all along. Those who didn't want to collect it for temple repair in the first place. Unfortunately, the southern kingdom is where Solomon's temple was located. And it had a priesthood that could no longer be trusted. You see how the whole nation, from the people to the kings and now to the priesthood, we're seeing the degradation of the entirety of the nation as far as the southern kingdom is concerned. So through these stories, God is showing us very clearly not only the degradation of the people, the degradation of their kings, and now he's put the degradation of the nation's priesthood out on the table for our careful consideration. He wanted everyone who would be reading these stories later on down the road to have no doubt in their minds as to the worthiness of Israel to merit that fifth bucket when it came time for that fifth bucket to fall. Is it any wonder when we come down to verse 17 that we see more of the fourth bucket of wrath, what that bucket of wrath held, continuing to pour upon God's people, and that it was affecting both the northern and the southern kingdoms? Notice that pouring of the fourth bucket continue in 2 Kings chapter 12, verse 7, the sword coming upon Israel. Then Hazael, king of Syria, went up and fought against Gath and took it. And Hazael set his face to go up to Jerusalem. Wow, things are getting serious now. This fourth bucket's beginning to look very serious. Hazael had the capital city of the southern kingdom directly in his sights. He was bent on conquering Jerusalem. Once he had their capital city, my goodness, he would have had the entire southern kingdom. It would have been his. But notice where Hazael's forces were fighting in verse 17. They were fighting against Gath, the Bible says. And if anyone recall Gath from our previous sessions, Gath had been Goliath's hometown. Goliath had come from Gath. Gath is where David had gone in his flight from Saul. Now Gath was where Hazael had gone in his quest to conquer the southern realm. And what's more, Hazael conquered Gath, we were just told in the verse. He took it. Now, before, Hazael had taken everything to the right side of the Jordan. Now where is he? He's almost to the Mediterranean Sea. As he's taken Gath. No longer was the pouring of Israel's fourth bucket of wrath just about cutting Israel short. To the east of the Jordan River, we might say. After Hazael conquered that territory, as you can see on the Gath map we've provided there, his forces had advanced deep inside Israel's western territory, nearly to the border of the Mediterranean Sea, as we've said. Israel's fourth bucket of wrath had the southern kingdom in a stranglehold. In an effort to appease the Syrian king and get out from under that stranglehold, perhaps even save the destruction of the temple, if not the southern kingdom itself, the kingdom of Judah, notice the quick action taken by Jehoash, the king of that southern realm, as we come to verse 18 in chapter 12. And Jehoash, king of Judah, took all the hallowed things that Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, and Ahaziah, his fathers, kings of Judah, had dedicated, and his own hallowed things that he had dedicated, all the gold that was found in the treasures of the temple of the house of the Lord, and in the king's house, and he sent it to Hazael, king of Syria. A payoff. Here's a payoff. And it worked. He, Hazael, went away from Jerusalem. So King Jehoash had, in some sense, saved the day. But he had to pay his way out of that dilemma. What a deplorable situation was taking place in the southern kingdom. In order to save face and field, in a manner of speaking, territory, the territory of their very capital, Jehoash had to pillage the temple of the Lord. He had to rob from God's house to save his head and to save the land. Of course, it wasn't as though the people of the southern kingdom had been honoring the Most High God in the first place, had they? For the most part, the people of the southern kingdom were continuing to sacrifice to false gods and to burn incense in the high places, as we just learned there in chapter 12, verse 3. While they had every opportunity to cry out to the Lord, to make their confession, the nation had failed the contract, and then cast themselves upon the Most High God by calling upon the Lord to exercise his name on their behalf graciously. They continued their course of dishonoring the Lord and honoring the false gods of the peoples around them. Now, if you think that pouring out of bucket of wrath number 4 was for the southern kingdom only, as we see it really Hazael's way into the land, take a look at what was going on in the northern kingdom during that time. Northern kingdom, Israel. Here it is in 2 Kings chapter 13, beginning with verse 1. In the 23rd year of Jehoash, the son of Ahaziah, the king of Judah, southern kingdom, Jehoahaz, the son of Jehu, began to reign over Israel, the northern kingdom, in their capital, Samaria. And Jehoahaz reigned 17 years. Now, given what had occurred in the southern kingdom, Judah, there would be no more opportune time for the people of the northern kingdom, knowing what was going on, Israel, to make their confession and to cast themselves upon the name of the Most High God. After all, they had a brand new king, and Jehu was now gone, and Jehoahaz had taken the throne. Surely King Jehoahaz would do what was right, right? Well, the correct answer is wrong. Not left, but wrong. In fact, God doesn't wait to give us the answer. He answers that question immediately in the very next two verses, verses 2 and 3. Take a quick look. And he, Jehoahaz, another king, did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, and followed the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, which made Israel to sin. He departed not from those sins of Nebat. And catch this, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, the northern kingdom. And the Lord delivered them into the hand of Hazael, king of Syria, and into the hand of Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael, all their days. Boy, the fourth bucket's really, you can see the bottom, the depth of the anger and the wrath that had settled to the bottom of bucket number 4 is now beginning to come out. Not only are they beginning to be cut short, but now the enemy's actually conquering parts of their land. Israel was still in the land, to be sure, but they had no more say-so in the land that God had given to their forefather Abram, and through him to them. The people of the northern kingdom were now suffering an occupation by the enemy. The sword sitting in bucket of wrath number 4 had been a sharp sword, to be sure. Israel was really feeling the effects, southern and northern kingdom. Bucket number 4 had brought total enemy occupation to the northern kingdom in those realms. So both kingdoms were in the throes of their promised fourth bucket of wrath. And it appears as though they were almost trying to bring on bucket of wrath number 5, doing their very best. Can you imagine God's anger at his defiant nation? Is it any surprise that when the fifth bucket of wrath does finally fall, that God will be walking contrary to his people in fury, as Leviticus 26 said? Now stop here for a moment and consider what we've seen take place over and over again. What always happened when wrath came upon the nation? Something sitting in those buckets of wrath, what did God always do in response? It was almost like he always took out a huge hypodermic needle filled with mercy and grace. And right when they were in their most desperate time, he would pump the handle down and just inject mercy and grace upon his people. We saw it to be true in connection with the previous 3 buckets of wrath, so why not here? In connection with bucket of wrath number 4. God was continually giving his nation an opportunity to learn who they were not and who he was, what he had the capacity to become on their behalf. This is precisely what the God of mercy and grace was about to do for the people of the northern kingdom. We see him jump into action on behalf of his people, Judah, as verses 5 and 6 get underway. And the Lord gave Israel a what? Savior, a deliverer. Savior, just a deliverer. So that they went out from under the hand of the Syrians. And the children of Israel dwelt in their tents as before times. Everything was getting back almost, we could say, to normal as God showered that northern realm with mercy and grace. What an injection of mercy and grace. Through that exercise of his name on Israel's behalf, God became Israel's banner, one of the aspects of his name, her Jehovah Nissi, her deliverer. He delivered them from the hand of the Syrians. What was the northern kingdom's response to God exercising his name on their behalf and doing so graciously? God recorded their response in verse 6. What a first word to begin a sentence. What is it? Nevertheless, or we might say all the more. Nevertheless, meaning in spite of God's grand display of what he was capable of doing for them, they departed not from the sins of the house of Jeroboam, who made Israel sin, but walked therein. Put simply, they thumbed their noses at the Most High God. And there remained the grove also in Samaria, the capital city of the northern realm. King after king after king, we see a different stanza of the very same song, do we not? After King Jehoahaz died, his son Jehoash assumed the throne of the northern realm, not the Jehoash of the southern realm, but they shared a common name. This would be a brand new opportunity for a national confession to be made by the northern kingdom. But verse 11 tells us that unfortunately for them, fortunately for us, as Paul would say, tell us later on down the road, fortunately for us, unfortunate for them, Israel's national confession was not to be made. Notice chapter 13, verse 11. And he, Jehoash of the northern kingdom, did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. He departed not from all the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. But he walked in those ways, those sinful ways. What was the result of King Joash's rebellion? The result was exactly what the nation's fourth bucket of wrath called for. King Hazael of Syria continued to oppress the northern realm. He'd been paid off earlier. Now he's oppressing them again. It was during this time, in the reign of King Joash, that the prophet Elisha died. But there isn't any doubt about it. At this point in Israel's history, they were actually pleading, in a sense, for the fifth bucket of wrath to fall on their heads. They had clearly merited that fifth bucket. They had defied the Lord. They had snubbed his grace and mercy. And God would have been perfectly justified to begin pouring that fifth bucket down right at that very time. But once again, what do you suppose God was ready to do? What have we seen him do time and again in connection with this hard-hearted, stiff-necked nation? He was continually putting his mercy and grace on display. And it would be no different now. You see, once bucket of wrath number 5 begins to pour, God knew that his people would experience a time of trouble such as they had not previously seen and would never see again, according to prophecy. Bucket number 5 called for a measure of wrath that would make all the difficulties of all the previous buckets combined pale in comparison to what was ahead. God knew that. God was fully aware of what was sitting in that fifth bucket of wrath. And God knew that it was coming. But God would leave no stone unturned when it came to educating his nation in the reality of their incapacity and the necessity of their calling upon his name to deal with them graciously. In light of what Israel's fifth bucket of wrath held, in light of the fact that God had known perfectly well the severity sitting in bucket number 5, notice what the Most High God did as we come to 2 Kings chapter 13, verse 23. And the Lord was, next word, gracious unto them. Wow. And had compassion on them, and had respect unto them, because of his covenant that he had made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, would not destroy them, neither cast he them from his presence. Notice carefully the next two words. What are they? As yet. Oh, it's coming. As yet. In spite of the downward progression of things under those kings, we see God deal out another dose of his mercy and grace in the midst of his people's obstinate rebellion. The sword sitting in their fourth bucket of wrath was being brought against them as the Syrian king was biting off more and more of Israel's territory or land. But we're given to understand in verse 23 that the fifth bucket of wrath called for his people to be cast out of his presence altogether. They wouldn't be occupied. They'd be out of their land if the fifth bucket fell. They'd be cast out of his presence. In verse 23, we see that he would not destroy them as yet. That destruction would come, to be sure, as God would indeed walk contrary to his people in fury. That's what the fifth bucket calls for. God was simply holding off that fury for a time. That's what the words as yet mean. He was postponing it in light of the wrath that he knew would be involved with that final bucket. How did God postpone the pouring of bucket of wrath number 5? And how did he display his mercy and grace in connection with that postponement of that wrath? For the answer to that, we need to continue reading with verses 24 and 25 as we come to the conclusion of 2 Kings chapter 13. So, Israel's oppressor, Hazael, king of Syria, died, and Ben-Hadad, his son, reigned in his stead. And Jehoash of the northern realm, the son of Jehoahaz, took again out of the hand of Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael, the cities. They've reconquered their territory, which he, Hazael, had taken out of the hand of Jehoahaz, his father, by war. 3 times did Joash beat him and recovered the cities of Israel. He took back the property. It was victory for Israel. As 2 Kings chapter 14 opens, Amaziah, the son of Jehoash of the southern kingdom, a different Jehoash here, had assumed his father's throne. We're going back and forth between kings, southern and northern realm. Like his father Jehoash, Amaziah was a relatively good king. as seen in chapter 14, verse 3, where we read, "And he, King Amaziah, did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, yet." Well, in the first verse it was nevertheless. Now here's yet, not like David his father. Can you get the feeling of this? He did that was right, what was right in the sight of the Lord, yet. See what was happening? Not like David his father. He did according to all things as Joash his father did. Once again, we see high hopes for God's people. And once again, we see those high hopes dashed on the rocks of the laissez-faire attitude of Judah's previously so-called good kings. Laissez-faire, for those who are not familiar with that French expression, means let the people do as they wish. And that's exactly what these kings were doing. Laissez-faire, we could say, has to do with a hands-off approach to things. Verse 4 contains the disappointing truth relative to Judah's king Amaziah and his laissez-faire attitude. Look at it here in chapter 14. "Howbeit the high places were not taken away. As yet the people did continue to sacrifice and burn incense on the high places." Talk about long-suffering. Was God not long-suffering when it came to the people of the northern and southern kingdoms, both? The people who were as yet his people? Reading through these stories of their kings leaves no doubt as to the laissez-faire attitude of the kings of both realms thus far in our stories. As we work our way farther into 2 Kings chapter 14, we see a face-off take place between Jehoash of the northern kingdom, Israel, and Amaziah of the southern kingdom, Judah. The two kingdoms did not only have to contend with Syria coming against them, they were now having to contend with one another. They were fighting between themselves. We don't want to belabor the stories of these kings, so we could go on and on, but the issue in our study of the book of 2 Kings is not one of trying to go through every detail of the ins and outs of every king. What is important that we see here is the trend that was taking place while these kings were in place, and the attitude, their attitude toward the Most High God, and the idol worship that was taking place in the land over which they were ruling during that period of time in Israel's history. Keep in mind, both kingdoms were sitting on the cusp, we might say, of the pouring out of bucket of wrath number 5. And it was detailed for them back in Leviticus chapter 26. In connection with the kings of both kingdoms, we've seen the expression, "and he did evil in the sight of the Lord." Did we not see it over and over? He did evil in the sight of the Lord, used time and again. Even when a king was seemingly on the right track, we see the words "nevertheless" or "howbeit," or the expression "as yet," as the people of both kingdoms were wholly given over to the worship of false gods. Aside from a very few kings and the worship of Baal, the worship of false gods continued forward full speed ahead. They set the throttle. We're going this direction. And it was a slap in the face of the Most High God. The statement we just read in 2 Kings chapter 14, verse 4, sums up the direction both realms of the kingdom were taking. "Howbeit the high places were not taken away, as yet the people did sacrifice and burn incense on the high place." It doesn't take us very long to memorize that song, does it? Over and over we hear the same refrain. When King Joash of the northern realm died, his son Jeroboam, another Jeroboam, Jeroboam number 2, assumed his father's throne. Amaziah of the southern kingdom lived and reigned 15 years beyond the death of the king of the northern kingdom. So don't, when you see these kings lined up side by side, don't assume that they were lined up side by side this way, because it doesn't fall in that some kings reigned a lot longer than others. And the people of Judah began to conspire against the king of the southern kingdom. After Amaziah of the southern kingdom died, the people of Judah took Amaziah's 16-year-old son, Ahaziah, and they made him king. Now, if we're going to go through 2 Kings, we've got to go through some of these stories. We'll not go into any more detail other than to give a summary statement for some of the remaining kings. We don't bore you to tears. The direction taken by Jeroboam of the northern kingdom appears in chapter 14, verse 24. "And he, Jeroboam, did that which was really good in the sight of the Lord," and just changed direction altogether. "He did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. He departed not from all the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin." How about 16-year-old Ahaziah of the southern realm? What was he like? Well, he went on to reign for 52 years, but he became king at 16. His summary statement sits in chapter 15, verses 3 and 4. Can you see how we're working our way through kings here? "And he, Ahaziah, did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father Amaziah had done." Next two words. Save that. With the exception of The high places were not removed. The people continued to sacrifice and burn incense still in the high places. You see the direction of these people? Now we're seeing that the kings of the northern kingdom were all bad kings. King Zechariah's statements recorded in chapter 15, verse 9, as more kings come down the road. And he, Ahaziah, did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, as his fathers had done. He departed not from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. The track record of the kings of both realms is a monotonous story. It would bore us to tears if we didn't really know what was lying on the horizon should that fifth bucket of wrath fall. And what are they doing? They're calling for it. They're begging for it. They're pleading for it. They're saying, bring it on. We don't care. And they continue to sacrifice to these false gods. And can you imagine God's anger as it was building below the surface? Building more and more and more. At this point, I'm going to give you a listing of all the kings of both kingdoms that appear in the book of 2 Kings. And we have this listing. It'll be on the website shortly, and you'll have both listings, the kings of 1 Kings, the kings of 2 Kings. The nice thing about this listing of the kings in 2 Kings is we give you the prophets' names that came along in connection with those different kings that were reigning. You can access it on the website very shortly. Welcome to grace.com under the resource tab. Understand that the broken record of these kings continues in the book of 2 Kings all the way up to the fall of the fifth bucket of wrath upon the nation Israel. That fifth bucket will fall upon the northern kingdom, Israel, first. Then a little later on in 2 Kings, we see that fifth bucket beginning to fall on the southern realm, Judah. But until then, let's just skip through these summary statements a bit more, a few more of these kings, and as this is what the book of 2 Kings is all about, proving to us the validity of God bringing that fifth bucket down with all that it held. For instance, when we come to chapter 15, verse 18, we find the summary statement of a king called King Menahem of the northern realm. Let's look. And he, King Menahem, did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. Departed not all his days from the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. Verse 19 goes on to reveal how bucket of wrath number 4 continued to pour out while all this was taking place. His people were walking contrary to him. He's now walking contrary to his people, but not in fury, not as yet. Every time we see the kingdom suffering at the hand of an enemy, we can see the Most High God walking contrary to his people. Notice the verse that follows right in the heels of verse 18, where King Menahem was doing that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. It's verse 19. And Pul, the king of Assyria, came against the land, another sword against the land. And Menahem gave Pul 1,000 talents of silver, that his hand might be with him to confirm the king. These kings were buying themselves out of misery here. They were paying off the enemy. The king of the northern kingdom was actually forced to pay the Assyrian king in order to maintain his position of power. The stories here remind me of a volcano. I don't know what you're seeing here, but they remind me of a volcano with a lava building toward the time when that volcano is going to explode and spew out the fiery contents that were always lying under the surface. That's how you can picture bucket of wrath number 5. That's how it was with God and Israel during the time of these kings while under the fourth bucket of wrath. The fifth bucket of wrath is the volcano. As these kings over the divided kingdom continued in their downward progression away from the Most High God and did nothing to move the people away from that idol worship, the contents of the volcano, namely that which bucket of wrath number 5 held, those contents were churning. We might say simmering, bubbling below the surface, building up, awaiting that time for bucket of 5 to arrive and explode with all the fiery fury of God's wrath that had been lying just under the surface. Here in the book of 2 Kings, God is in a very real sense giving us a first-hand look at the bubbling that was taking place below the surface of the volcano, bucket of wrath number 5. As the people of both realms were in a constant state of rejecting him. After King Menahem came King Pekahiah to reign over the northern realm. As chapter 15 continues, the ongoing simmering saga, we can keep reading it over and over. Here it is in 2 Kings chapter 15, verse 24. And he, Pekahiah, called upon the people to make their confession. We have not kept the contract. We swore to you we could keep it. We're calling upon your name, exercise your name on our behalf and do it graciously. Is that what the verse says? Pekahiah did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. He departed not from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. After Pekahiah came King Pekah. So it looks like pretty much the same name, but it's not. Over the northern realm. His summary statement appears in verse 28. We're really moving, believe it or not, through 2 Kings. 15:28. And he, Pekah, did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. He departed not from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. Now watch as bucket number 4 continues to pour. God constantly showing what they're meriting as we come to verse 29. In fact, the sparks of bucket of wrath number 5, the volcano, are beginning to spray out a little bit from the top of that volcanic bucket at this point in time. 2 Kings 15:29. In the days of Pekah, king of Israel, came Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and took Ijon, and Abel-Beth-Maacah, and Genoa, and Kadesh, and Hazor, and Gilead, and Galilee, all the land of Naphtali, and carried them captive to Assyria. Wow. You see what was happening? The entire northern kingdom of Israel had not been spewed out of the land, at least not as yet. But a portion of the northern kingdom, the people of the land of Naphtali, had been taken away captive by the king of Assyria. And captivity was precisely what the 5th bucket of wrath called for. But this is a partial captivity here. It was as though the volcanic bucket of wrath, bucket number 5, was right on the verge of a catastrophic eruption. The steam of the 5th bucket was beginning to billow forth in anticipation of an outright cataclysmic explosion. The Bible narrative then moves straight to Jotham, the new king over the southern realm. His story reads much like the many stories we've already read. Here it is toward the close of chapter 15, verses 34 and 35. And he, Jotham, did that which was right in the sight of the Lord. He did according to all that his father Uzziah had done. Next word. Howbeit, there sits that word. Howbeit, the high places were not removed. The people sacrificed, continued to sacrifice, burn incense still in the high places. He, Jotham, built the higher gate of the house of the Lord. So he's working for the Lord with one hand. He built the higher gate of the house, while refusing to work against the worship of false gods with his other hand. An apostle of the earthly kingdom program, James would later say in James 1:8, a passage you can look up on your own, a double-minded man is unstable in his ways. In all his ways. That's an apt description of the kings who were good on the one hand. He did what was right. Then we came around that word nevertheless, refusing to take action when it came to idol worship on the other hand. God was not pleased with that double-mindedness, as we see the smoke that preceded the fire of bucket number 5 continue to billow forth in verse 37. In those days the Lord began to send against Judah Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah. When we come to the final chapter of 2 Kings chapter 16, at least where the 4th bucket of wrath and the northern kingdom is concerned, we've come all the way down to King Ahaz, king of Judah. There are a couple of interesting things sitting in this passage you need to take note of before we end this session with King Ahaz. Let's read chapter 16, verses 2 and 3. 20 years old was Ahaz when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem and did that which was right in the sight of the Lord his God, like David his father. But he walked in the way of the kings of Israel, yea, and made his son to pass through the fire, according to the abominations of the heathen, whom the Lord cast out from before the children of Israel. King Ahaz himself fully engaged in idol worship, even to the point of laying his son, infant son, on the sacrificial altar, as this artist's depiction illustrates. He was arguably the most evil, the most wicked, the most vile king ever to reign on the throne of the southern kingdom. One source states that they would heat this idol up with fire until it was glowing red hot. And then they would take their infants and place them into the arms of that red-hot idol Molech. Can you imagine? Talk about shaking a fist in the face of the Most High God. King Ahab was shaking both fists in God's direction as he was participating in this most heinous pagan ritual to the false god Molech. This gives a whole new different perspective in which to view King Solomon, who built a high place to Molech, does it not? 2 Kings 16:4, and he, Ahaz, sacrificed and burnt incense in the high places, and on the hills and under every green tree. The idol worship of that day always took place in the hills and the high places. The expression in 2 Kings is echoed in 2 Chronicles chapter 28, verse 4. He, Ahaz, sacrificed and also burnt incense in the high places and on the hills and under every green tree. Any of you recall another passage in Scripture where it talks about the hills? How about Psalms 121, 1 and 2? I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord, which made heaven and earth. Do you see it there? I don't have that. There it is. I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills. Okay, it's been suggested that since there isn't any punctuation in the Hebrew, nor is there in the Greek, that the punctuation being added by the translators would perhaps be better put in a different place or different punctuation. How about if Psalms 121 verse 1 read this way, I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, question mark. From whence cometh my help, question mark. My help cometh from the Lord, which made heaven and earth. That would make sense in light of Jeremiah's statement in Jeremiah chapter 3 verse 23, where the prophet wrote, truly in vain is salvation hoped for from the hills and from the multitude of mountains. Truly in the Lord our God is the salvation of Israel. You see something there? The prophet Ezekiel added this part, his part in Ezekiel chapter 6 verse 3, where he wrote this about the hills and the high places. And say, ye mountains of Israel, hear the word of the Lord God. Thus saith the Lord God to the mountains and to the hills, to the rivers and to the valleys. Behold, even I will bring a sword upon you, and I will destroy your high places. Now you can do whatever you want with that, but I bring it to your attention in light of where Israel's idol worship was being conducted. And we've just seen that take place in regard to the idol worshiping King Ahaz of the southern realm. The smoke had been billowing from the volcanic judgment sitting in Israel's bucket number 5. It was building up, the lava of that bucket number 5, building underneath, just underneath the surface. What should we expect to see next? Would you say it might be time for the 5th bucket of wrath, the cataclysmic explosion of that 5th bucket to begin to erupt? Well, in our next section, session, we'll examine that outcome. For now, we'll close it off right there. But you've seen the trend of the kings, the ruination of Israel's rulers, and thus the ruination of the nation.